Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our recall triad for the final lesson, which is pages 95 to 117. We're going to take a look at a recap of the testimony of Paul and the testimony of John. Remember, Luther closed his argument on page 95. He was done with his argument on page 95, but he said he wanted to close out with testimony from Paul and testimony from John. And so we're going to take just a quick recap look at that testimony, because basically Luther, his entire argument enlisted the book of Romans, the Gospel of John, and the book of Genesis, and Isaiah 40. That was pretty much it. It was the book of Romans, the Gospel of John, and Isaiah 40. That was pretty much where he went to build his defense against Erasmus. So we'll begin with Paul, and that's going to be Romans and 1 Corinthians. Paul testifies that all men are under the wrath of God, and the gospel is the power unto salvation. Paul also tells us the gospel is incomprehensible to fallen man, who must be called by the power of God before we can comprehend any of the gospel. And then finally, all humanity is under sin. All humanity, universally, is under sin. No man in himself can do any good at all toward God. So, from Romans and from 1 Corinthians, Luther says there is more than adequate testimony from Paul that he did teach during the apostolic age the doctrine of original sin, the doctrine of the fallen nature of man. But he also says that John the Beloved also gave us apostolic authoritative testimony as well. So block 2, we're going to look at the Gospel of John. John testifies the darkness of man's nature cannot comprehend Christ's gospel. We are all universally spiritually blind. We can't see the gospel of Jesus Christ because we're spiritually blind. We're blind to the truth of the gospel. Also, we are born not of the will of man, but of God. That's key, that John 1:12 and 13. That specifically even tells us it's not the will of man. It is not the will of man. It is of God. It is sovereign, born again, spirit regenerating work. That is giving all the glory to God. You must be born again before you can ever even see, recognize, hear the gospel of Jesus Christ, before you can ever have faith toward Jesus Christ. You must be quickened by the Spirit first to have that heart of stone removed and replaced with a heart of flesh. Then you can hear the gospel. You may have sat in church and listened to the gospel 100 times, but until you are quickened by the Spirit and then hear the gospel, that's the time when you hear it in a life-changing way. That's the time when you hear it in a way where it can actually penetrate your heart of flesh. But Luther taught being born again comes prior to justification. It's not equal to justification. It comes prior to justification. The quickening of the Spirit comes first. It's called being drawn by the Father to Christ. That has to happen first. Then you can hear in a way where the gospel will imprint your heart. And then he gives us some conclusions at the end of the book. Block 3, the carnal nature is enmity against God. God's wisdom, God's judgment are unsearchable to fallen man. We can't comprehend God's righteousness. We can't comprehend God's truth. We cannot comprehend the gospel of Jesus Christ unless we are quickened by the Spirit first. And then Psalm 73 reiterates that only through God's help and intervention do we come to understand the way of Christ. Everything's veiled to human knowledge. We don't understand the wisdom of God. We don't understand the righteousness of God. We also are not, of our own power, even able to do righteousness. We don't know what it is, and we don't know how to do it. We're not empowered to do righteousness. So Luther says, quickening of the Spirit must come first. That's called being born again. Remember, when Christ was talking to Nicodemus, how did he describe being born again? It's like the wind. You don't know where it's coming from. It's like the wind. You don't know where it's coming from. It's not the calculated part. He didn't tell Nicodemus, first you have to say the confessing prayer. You have to say this. You have to do this. He said, no. Being born again, it's like the wind. You do not know where it's coming from. So Luther said, being born again is not equated with justification. Being born again is the quickening of the Spirit that removes the heart of stone, replaces it with a heart of flesh, so that the elected person, who is one of the elect, will be able to hear the gospel in a life-changing way and be empowered to respond with faith. Let's review that church history, though, at the bottom, that kind of encircled Luther during the Reformation. In 325 AD, at the Council of Nicaea, they put down the heresy of Arius by declaring, through Athanasius, that Christ is co-eternal, Christ is co-substantial with the Father. They upheld the doctrine of the Trinity. And then in 412 AD, at the Council of Carthage, they put down the heresy of Pelagius, who denied original sin, who denied the fallen nature of man. That started this whole problem that was around when Luther had to respond to Erasmus. But it was put down by Augustine, who did posit the doctrine of the fallen nature of mankind. We have a fallen human will. We do have a fallen nature because of the doctrine of original sin. Unfortunately, the Catholic Church, through Pope Zosimus in 412, also condemned the Council of Carthage and said, no, the Catholic Church is going to side with Pelagius. We're going to side with Pelagius, and that way the believer has to work with the priest and cooperate with the priest to attain salvation, because it becomes a works righteousness. So the Pelagian heresy was upheld by Pope Zosimus. In 1525, that's when Erasmus, in the midst of this Pelagian heresy, wrote the diatribe of free will. That was countered by Luther's Bondage of the Will, and it became the synergistic doctrine versus monergistic doctrine conflict. Synergistic means working together. We must work together with God in order to attain salvation. That became the doctrine of the Catholic Church, the synergistic view. The Reformation theology of Luther said no, monergistic doctrine. It is by God's grace and God's grace alone that we are saved. All glory goes to God. We don't cooperate and contribute to salvation. We are gifted salvation entirely due to the grace of God. Entirely due to the grace of God. But unfortunately, the Catholic Church came back 20 years later at the Council of Trent and said, nope, we're going to go back to Pelagian heresy again. We're going to deny man's fallen nature. They did it again. And then the Reformers got their word in 1618 at the Council of Dort, and Arminianism, which was semi-Pelagianism, was semi-Pelagian heresy. The Council of Dort called Arminius's heresy. Semi-Pelagian view was heresy. And they posited 5-point Reformation theology, which has become known to be today as 5-point Calvinism. That'll wrap up our little quick recall triad for the final lesson on Martin Luther's Bondage of the Will.